Hello again, Dr. Hargrove. I'm back once more, this time to talk about my essay on the abolition of the slave trade in Africa beginning in 1807. In it, I discuss some of the effects on Africa, but largely I focus on the idea that the abolition itself was in fact a sham, and that the powers that be were not acting in good faith, but in fact continued to exploit slave labor, either by subverting their own laws or turning a blind eye, or investing heavily, as Britain did after 1807, in the sugar trade and in mining concerns in the Caribbean, where they continued to profit off of slave labor. My first point is really in trying to understand the demographic change that happened in Africa as a result of the slave trade, in which over the course of about 300 years, roughly 12.5 million Africans were sold into slavery, and just the demographic impact of having that many, generally young and able-bodied men and women removed from a society that they could have contributed to otherwise has an impact that cannot possibly be calculated, but it must be immense. Next, I discussed the economic impact of the slave trade. In fact, when many scholars, and this is, I think, changing now, but in the past, many historians have argued that the continent of Africa as a whole, its poor economic development was due to the colonial period, but they ignore that that was a relatively brief time compared to the time of the slave trade. And I have an article from the Quarterly Journal of Economics that makes some interesting points in that regard, and that not only was it an economic problem, but a social problem as well, because there became a culture of slave trading which undermined the very social fabric of various sovereignties and kingdoms in Africa, to the point where violence, increased violence, and often for political gain, kidnappings were frequent. The King of Congo, for instance, sent a letter to Portugal in the early 1500s complaining that there are so many slave traders around that he doesn't know how to deal with them, and in fact members of his own family had been kidnapped and sold into slavery for political gain, which is another impact that cannot be calculated. And finally, although this probably should be earlier, I have an article by a Nigerian scholar named Adiel Afigbo, and her main point is that when talking about slavery and the slave trade, they've generally been considered in the same terms, whereas they are really separate and distinct. And even though, let's see the great quote, slave trade and slavery are the two heads of the monster that British colonial rulers called slave dealing in their proclamations and ordinances aimed at abolishing the slave trade and bringing out the emancipation of those already entrapped in slavery. And she goes on to advance the point that even though technically the slave trade was illegal after 1807, the slavery existed, and the culture of slavery existed and never really ended. It can be argued that the period in which the slave trade was active lasted all the way through colonialism. There are technically about 70 75 years in between, but nothing really changed during that time. It was just basically, it's rebranding essentially. Is particularly what the British did as they continued to act in bad faith and participate in the trade in one way or another. And finally, my overall point is that there's no way to know how much damage was done and what could have been if Africa had been allowed to develop at her own pace instead of continually being exploited, a situation that still exists to this day, and partly because they were so far behind in industrial development that they now, a lot of countries will depend on outside capital, and they're essentially making a deal with the devil, and not a whole lot has changed in that regard. Okay, that's it. Thank you.